Welcome to Ras Temari Radio, Offense Necessary, where we talk about anything but politics. Congratulations to everybody that got to the Day of Adwa. Actually, it's called Happy Holidays to us.
Happy Adwa.
Happy Adwa, yes. So today I'm gonna be your host. My name is Iman and I have Zewde here with me. So Zewde, what is something you taught yourself about Adwa?
Well, Iman, this is what, our fourth episode or something like that together? Fourth or fifth episode together. We're just trying a lot at this point. 3 months in. This is also like a bit of a, I think yesterday would be an anniversary for the program, for the project. 3 month anniversary. Quarter of a year, and 20 something episodes in, so that's good. But yeah, Adwa, I guess this is some years ago when I was studying at the doctoral level history, Ethiopian history. One of my favorite books, and really one of the most comprehensive books, one of the rare examples of a European who really does not do Eurocentric writing, was this guy Sven Rubenson, who died some years ago. Wrote a book called The Survival of Ethiopian Independence. And on this Adwa Day, I hope that people who are interested in reading, mostly Ethiopians read Ethiopian history in Amharic, obviously. And there's a lot of good stuff on that as well. But if you want to read something from a foreigner's perspective in English, it's a very detailed and comprehensive account of really trying to answer the very central question, which is how come Ethiopia? Why Ethiopia? Why did Ethiopia survive as a free nation? Out of all of the nations involved in trying to resist, to the extent that anyone tried to resist the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. And it's worth noting, I mean, Africanist historians really outside of Ethiopia will tell you it was a watershed moment, not just for Ethiopia. I mean, of course for Ethiopia, but for the whole continent. That was it. That was the stemming of the tide. It's not just an important event for Ethiopia, but first of all, it showed other African countries what was possible. Right? So it's a reference point. Adwa is a reference point to the anti-colonial resistance of the 60s. Of, hey, we can do this. And that's by having some sense of solidarity. And of course, for those who are mostly invested, without getting into politics now, in nationalist politics within, or ethnic politics within any particular country, the only way to do this is to build consensus and to build blocks. And there can be no unity among Africans as a whole in resistance to neocolonialism until there's unity among Ethiopians, or unity among people within any particular nation. So he shows, Sven Rubenson, first of all, draws on, methodology is very important. He draws on Ethiopian documents, a lot of it like recent contemporary documents, to look back at that period. And he does away with this very annoying thing that people do, which is geographic determinism. Okay. They talk about Ethiopia, or they talk about the lack of willpower on the part of the British could have, when they had Theodore Spoxton, or, they could have, well, not really. I mean, they could have some kind of control, but not colonialism. There was no lack of willpower to have that control, especially, of course, eventually by the Italians. So the victory was really, he attributes it not so much to a lack of will on the part of the Europeans, nor does he attribute it to, the geographical terrain. Ethiopia is a mountainous terrain at its core, and this is what, I mean, this is the same thing people say about why the Germans lost World War II when they went into Russia. As it's cold and it's snowy and difficult in Siberia. It's like, well, not really. I mean, Stalingrad's not really in Siberia, and that's where they were pushed back. So it has more to do with actual will, of not the lack of will of the Europeans, but a willpower to establish foreign policy, and to engage in resistance, and to become aware, to become conscious of the stakes of what was going to happen if Italy took on. Now, this doesn't just come from Menelik, and it doesn't just come from the ruling powers, but it came from the society as a whole. And so I think it is immensely important that we continue to hold Adwa dear, that we continue to celebrate it each year and continue to remind ourselves of it, no matter what issues that go on within Ethiopia. That this is one way in which Ethiopia is a symbol of resistance. My only thing that I would add that's a little bit critical is, Ethiopian nationalism has this weird contradiction. I think I've mentioned this on here before. Ethiopian nationalism has a weird contradiction
Why?
within it. Well, because on the one hand, so I grew up in West Africa as an Ethiopian, but in West Africa, and people would say to me, like, this is in the 90s, but I think this is still the case now. Oh, you're going to Africa Agar. Like when I leave here to go back to Senegal, they'd be like, oh, you're going Africa Agar, Africa Agar, and I'm like, this is Africa Agar. Like, do people realize? Like, sometimes the only people who are really solidly aware of the fact that this is Africa are Ethiopians who lived among white people for a long period of time. People in the diaspora would come back, no, this is Africa. Trust me, everybody here is black. That makes us, by definition, Africa. And there is this mentality of, like, not just that we're different, because it's okay to be different. I mean, most non-Ethiopian Africans, Kenyans, Ugandans, they come here and they're like, oh, this is a little different. That's cool. There's no problem with being different. But there is some sense of superiority, especially among certain groups, who hold Ethiopianism most dear, who are most nationalistic. There's a sense of we're better than, or like where Ethiopians are somewhere as an intermediary on a spectrum, on a hierarchy between Europeans at the top and Africa at the bottom. Yeah. And it's like, well, we can't have it both ways. And that's what I really urge people to do is pick one, and I personally would pick, no matter what, complaints I have about Ethiopian society, and we all complain, but I would say pick the direction or the path of nationalism, not just Ethiopian nationalism, but Ethiopia as a symbol of black pride, of black resistance, of a free black nation. Because there's so much potential there for the stories that we tell and for what this country can represent, as far as resistance, as far as an alternative. But that's as a leader of African countries, not we're better than, and we are not really like the other Africans. And that's what I mean by the contradiction between Ethiopian nationalism.
I think it has a lot to do about the way we were raised. Adwa has been such a sacred celebration, especially in my house, like my family members and my economy. The first thing I learned about Adwa was just like, I remember this, my aunt is actually the first person to tell me about the story of Adwa, and she was playing the song by Gigi, Adwa, the one we played like a few minutes ago when we started this episode. And I asked her, what is the song about? And she tells me it's just like, this song is about Ethiopian history, a history in our lives where we actually had the power to defeat white power, which a lot of Africans did not believe was possible. And then Adwa opened that road, and every other African nation, every other African country actually started believing in the fact that Africa has power. So some people like take it as a point of superiority, but it's not a point of superiority. It's basically like opening the road, opening a new path, showing other people the possibility that yes, united you are strong, but separated you are weak. So for me, what I took from that is Adwa is it's not just an example of the fact that regardless of your race, it doesn't mean you're a winner or loser. It just means that when you're united, you can actually protect your country. And that's what it brings back for me. Every year I celebrate Adwa, and I just like take some time to just like really acknowledge it with a lot of my friends, because it's that confidence it brings back to the black community. Just like you are not powerless, you're just powerful united. Just like an army comes into the country united, and the army that's within the country, if it's united, can actually fight back. So it's the first war that like gave us that common enemy that was not within the country. It came from outside, and we had that power to defeat that enemy. And at the time, Italy was the enemy, and Italians being defeated was actually offensive to them, but it made us feel more powerful, and that's, I think, is what goes on through a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that the argument that Rubenson is reacting to, so you mentioned Italy, is the lack of political will, because there were, Italy's always been very fragmented, and there's always the stereotype about, oh, Italians aren't really fighters, they just like to sing or whatever. But really, I mean, there is always fragmentation, and there were people, chanting Viva Menelik in parades in Rome, by the opposition that did not want Italy to be a part of to try to be a colonial power. But that's not why they lost, right? What they lost was really a matter of solidarity. What you said, like, black people are not powerless. It's just a matter of not allowing ourselves to be divided. Divide and rule is really the main way in which Europeans, have had an advantage. That and the projection, right? The psychological projection, like, we're so civilized. You're the savage. When you can convince people that you're there to civilize them, and so they might ignore, I've mentioned this on stage before, but the fact that Europeans went and did the most savage things everywhere in the world, but the irony being always while claiming to be the civilized ones, and you're the savage, right? And when you can get people to believe that, when you can get people to accept their own powerlessness, or worse yet, their own villainy, and that they need you to save them or to salvage them, then you really have control over them, and they won't even know their subjugation. They'll learn to love their chains. It's funny. I had this conversation with a couple people too about some of the effects of, and I'll tell a really quick. I think it was one of my aunts who told me this. Schoolyard kind of ditty, like a little folksy. I forget what they call these, but a limerick, I think they call it, in Amharic, and they used to teach us in Ethiopian schools. It goes, "Minilik tawallo ba'anu sugasha, ግብሩ እንቁላል ነበር ይህን ያበሻ." You know that one? It's so. I mentioned this because the idea of, okay, if Menelik hadn't been born and hadn't picked up a shield to fight, Ethiopians would be eating eggs, because I guess the joke is that carbonara or whatever Italian sauces require eggs, right?
I see. Right.
So they'd be taking taxes on eggs because the Italians are really into eggs, So, but it's a joke. It's a funny joke, but I only think about this because most places in Africa, I think I talked about this with you as well, with a number of people. Most places in Africa, sadly, what do they eat? In Kenya, it's very British style food, which is to say, not very good food. It's just like meat plopped up and potatoes. No offense to our Kenyan friends, but in some places it's oxtail, it's different kinds of porridge, it's fufu. In some places, like where I grew up in Senegal, there's access to the sea, so there's rice dishes, and with a lot of fish, and But a lot of places there isn't much food culture. Not to the extent that we have in Ethiopia. I mean, you could go on and on for days describing Ethiopian dishes. You could go on and on for hours just talking about the breakfast dishes that we have. During this it's right now, and there's no. I mean, I've been around white people who are like, oh my goodness, Ethiopians, like I can be a vegetarian now because I just discovered Ethiopian food. Yeah. You know what I mean? And they're always shocked, that Simpsons scene. Oh my God, my tongue is dancing from this kind of food. And here's the sad part about it, right? You figure this has to do with colonialism as well. Colonialism affects other aspects of the society besides political power. And that's what a lot of these limericks are kind of reminders of. So one aspect is the food culture and the agriculture. I mean, in Senegal, again, where I grew up, I keep referring back to Senegal, but the entire, it's a society based on one cash crop. Here it's coffee, but there it's peanuts, nahashid, right? And so what you do is you get rid of a lot of the rich indigenous sort of food culture.
I see.
And so you figure if colonialism had not happened, think about all of the rich African indigenous food culture and the agriculture that goes with that would have existed, that does not. It probably would be the equivalent to Ethiopia. Now, of course, some of these dishes still remain, and we have memory of some of the stuff, but especially with all the fusions that happen once the continent becomes aware, other countries become aware of itself, there's so much lost possibility that we'll never know, or that we've forgotten about, just that one aspect. And that's what resistance is about. I mean, I think about this when it comes to the Native American traditions, the Native American experience in the United States. Living on reservations, they eat fried bread. I think I mentioned that on here. But fried bread is much like eating oxtail, or meaning like porridge. It's because they were placed on, and they still live on, a lot of the worst lands. A lot of the bad lands is where they were placed. Their reservations. So I mean, the Native Americans have incredible food culture.
Yeah.
But Now, mostly what they survive on is fried bread. That's like a Native American thing because it doesn't take much cuisine. It doesn't take much access to agriculture. So these are the consequences of colonialism. This is also what we're fighting for, right?
Yeah.
There's genocides, and then there's cultural genocides, where you wipe out all not just the people, but all evidence that they ever existed, right? And that's really what's at stake when something like the Battle of Adwa takes place, and a country is fighting for its survival.
Yeah, it's basically like keeping the authenticity within that culture or that country. It's now we have a bunch of African countries that have different types of ethnicity within them, and but then when their common language or their common understanding comes from a particular colonial era, or on a lot of people in a lot of countries that were colonized either speak French or English or British English, and they have this European type of ways of life. That's like their common ground. But in countries like Ethiopia, for a really long time, our common language is actually Amharic. Or if you go to Kenya or like most of the African countries, it's Swahili. And keeping that authenticity, keeping that culture, keeping that community, and not being able to crush that love for your country and your confidence in yourself and in your country to be able to accomplish things. That's, I think, what Adwa reminds us of. It's basically like having faith in what you have. Yeah. So
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You mentioned language. The idea of, they call this the lingua franca. I think that's Latin. Lingua franca is like the widely spoken language, widely accepted language, out of a number of other languages. So again, I keep mentioning Senegal today. I don't know why. But Senegal is Senegal is also is on the opposite coast of the continent, but also has this very strong sense of independence, or a strong sense of nationalism, resistance, often labor resistance, an old Marxist tradition. A lot of things in common, but in spite of the geographical distance. But in Senegal, the lingua franca is Wolof, and there's a couple other groups. There's Serer, there's Jolof, and so on. But there's Wolof is the most widely spoken, the lingua franca, and this is controversial in the same way that Amharic is controversial, because of the ethnic politics. Like, we were like, well, maybe, and I worked on this many years ago, did research on medium instruction policy. I think this is a really important question. Obviously, language of the public sector, of offices and so on, is very important. It's very sensitive. But then you have in the educational sector, where you're also bringing in questions of pedagogy, like what language to teach kids that makes it better for them to raise them up. When it comes to issues of not so much pedagogy but politics, some people might argue that English is better because it's more neutral, right? Because you don't have one ethnic group. No matter what lingua franca you choose, if it's indigenous, it's going to be imposed on the people.
Okay.
And so pedagogically, it's probably better to go with an indigenous language, so people are more immersed in it in terms of education. But in terms of politics, you might want to go with a language like English. So this is the thing, like, there's always going to be that's another area of this contradiction, right? Where between the internal dynamics or the internal imperial dynamics, right, and the external ones. And the internal dynamics, this is a very controversial thing. Like, what we're picking one language, whether it's Amharic or the Kasi Swahili was Wolof, and one ethnicity feels like they're or Oromifa or whatever. One ethnicity feels that they're imposed on the other. But this is the thing. Sometimes that's to maintain unity and to maintain something that's distinctly ours, as you put it, in the face of cultural penetration. And this is what I mean by there's always those weird contradictions between, the external power dynamic and the internal one,
Yeah. So what is like the one thing from this particular day that has inspired you in your life and made you feel like, I'm good, I can move forward, you know what I mean? Like, what is it about Adwa that gave you a certain sense of confidence?
Me personally?
You personally, yes.
Boy, we didn't celebrate Adwa in my household the way apparently you guys did. I don't know how widespread of a thing that is. Do you think that's a widespread thing here?
Yeah, there are people, usually the people that have that celebrate Adwa very, you know, with a lot of pomp are people who have been maybe in a military family household,
Yeah.
or historians,
Right.
Pan-African
Right.
leaders. I've celebrated Adwa with Pan-Africans this one time, and it was like this great big event that they threw, and like everybody's wearing different types of Ethiopian garb. It didn't matter from what ethnicity it was. It was just a representation of Ethiopian unity and Ethiopian culture. And it depends on the circles, I think, you run in, and it depends on the conversations you have about that particular day. And for some people, it's just another holiday, like where you take a break. It's just like, it's just Adwa. You hear about it, but it's not, it doesn't trigger anything within you. Right. So like my question,
we don't have a thing like, sorry to cut you off, but in the United States, July the 4th is marked by fireworks, and it's summer, so there's a barbecue, and there's you know what I mean, like certain things that make people remember this is not just any other day, this is July the 4th, and then kind of put an imprint in childhood of a kind of nationalism, right, that it's necessary to kind of maintain coherence, right, and like all these, we don't really have specific, I mean, I think they blast cannons on Adwa. Do we have specific rituals?
Not really. So it's like different communities do different things. For example, there's a Git'em Sitem tonight that's happening.
Right.
And it's also the 1-year anniversary of Git'em Sitem, and it is also, the theme is Adwa. So everybody's going to do poetry on Adwa.
This is at Shifta Bar and Restaurant. Okay.
Shifta Bar and Restaurant. And now in this kind of environment, you'll hear a lot of Adwa. You'll hear a lot of information, a conversation, you know. It's just the community that creates the celebration. And usually you see the shield for Adwa, like the old shields that people in that time used to use. So you'll see that as a decoration in different places.
Right.
You'll see people wearing different military suits. You'll see people taking a walk on, doing what's it called? Oh my goodness, I forgot the word. Okay, parade. Yes.
Parade, okay.
Yes, doing a parade on Adwa. Like I have a few of my friends sending me pictures about the parades that they did, and pictures is basically, like I said, is the community that understands the value of the celebration that celebrates it. And some people, I'm not gonna lie, celebrate it for the wrong reasons as well, but at the end of the day, it triggers something for all Africans, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think it triggers for most people?
Well, I can't speak for everybody, but I think it's for me it's unity. So I think it triggers a lot of unity for a lot of the people that have been around me, at least, because without that unity and without that understanding, and another person we should mention when it comes to Adwa is the Pt.1, which is actually the queen at the time, and she got a lot of the soldiers to come into the war and defeat another African. It's like there is actually a poem, I'm gonna look into this, that about Pt.1 betule እጁን እየጋተች or ምን እየጋተች በለው የምትል. Please somebody correct me on this one, because it was a very significant part of Ethiopian culture. Also, the women had a lot of impact to play in this. It was just, it went beyond race, it went beyond sex, it went beyond religion. It was just about uniting to defeat a common enemy. And that unity and that value in different cultures and in different ways of being is what Adwa represents for me, and what Adwa represents for a lot of the people that are around me. So, which is why I ask, what does it represent for anybody that's in different public zones. So I haven't been to any other place to celebrate Adwa. I plan on doing that in the future, and I'd like to see what that brings about for people.
Yeah, I understand. I know what you mean. It's really the celebrations that bring out the intentions, right? Like exactly how are people dressed, how festive are people. I'd be interested in hearing what kind of poems people come out and perform at tonight's event, or at any other kind of events, and also the meaning of these celebrations evolve with time, over time and over space. You know, different people kind of see these things differently. Now, of course, again, Menelik being a controversial figure now, right, that complicates things a little bit. But I hope that people can have, you can kind of hold two opinions of somebody at the same time, even if they resent certain aspects of his rule, and what it meant for certain people, and the significance that has now. That, at the same time, there is resistance to sort of the greater kind of the more deep and the more profound kind of threat of, again, exactly what would have happened to this country. We'll never know if Italy had been successful. People can joke, oh, we'd be speaking Italian, but what else? Like, you know what I mean? Yeah. What would we, not so much what would we have acquired, but what would we have lost that we maintain? I mean, would we have kept our alphabet? And to what extent would the alphabet be widely taught? I mean, the Italians wouldn't have kept teaching Guz as an alphabet in schools, right? When literacy campaigns, like, during the Zammacha, and, you know what I mean, in the 70s, they wouldn't have been, if the Italians hadn't had literacy campaigns, I'm sure they would have. It would have been in Italian and using the Roman alphabet, right? Our way of counting the day. I told somebody about this back when I was in college, and I realized how fascinating this is to certain people, not to everybody. But I remember I told this girl I knew in Europe, a college student, I was like, oh, Ethiopia, we got our own way of counting the day. We start the day at, this always creates some confusion between you and I, and between me and certain people, when you're like, you mean 2, 3, or you mean 8, 9, because we count the day at 6 hours difference. But it's just a different conception of time. Yeah. It's just a completely different conception of time, a different calendar, different. Obviously, there's different clothing in different places in Africa, and that's been maintained. But still, certain things that aren't appropriated or that don't fuse into European styles of clothing is what Ethiopians have. It's a little bit more preserved. The music, right. I mean, there's great African music all over the place, but I venture, not that I'm an expert in this, to say that Ethiopia has more of a range of musical styles than you find in most places, right? Just in general, when you look at any aspect of Ethiopian culture, people might like it, people might not. Some people don't like injera, that's fine, but it's hard to argue that there's a nation that has more of a broad array of diversity within each cultural art form, or within each cultural practice within that one country. If you compare it to any other context, it's hard pressed to find like Mali, certain places. And Ethiopia also, I remember this historian in the U.S. was saying, Ethiopia is it's different dealing with Ethiopia in a sense that Ethiopia is one of a handful of countries that has a large enough literate population that it has a national consciousness and a national approach to its history. Okay. So, for instance, it's really South Africa, Nigeria, I think, again, to some extent Senegal, maybe one or two other countries have a large enough literate population that Nigerian historians study Nigeria, whereas a historian in Mali or in Benin is more likely to study the region or the transnational implications, right? Because there's just not enough of a literate audience and not enough of a literary culture, indigenous, to that country, to really, to really have a following in that, or to really develop that. Okay. So and who knows if we would have kept that, so yeah, that's how significant a day like Adwa is.
So, I would like to mention one taboo topic for a lot of people that every time I mention it in Adwa, it creates this kind of why would you say that?
Go ahead.
So, after Adwa, Ethiopia was actually, Addis Ababa was colonized for 5 years. And when you talked about how different it could be, the very first thing that comes to mind for me, what it would be like is has anybody ever been in Piazza in Ethiopia?
Yeah.
You see a lot of Italian architecture.
Right.
You see a lot of Italian food. You get the best pizza there, the best pasta, lasagna. Oh my God, I love Italian food and I love Italian architecture. There's so much value and beauty in it.
So do I.
But it's not Ethiopian culture. It's not the same. It's not authentic. Yes, perhaps we would have looked more like Italy, but is that something to actually feel proud about? And I've actually had a few people argue with me, like, maybe we should have been colonized. We would be more, more global. We would be more civilized.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, but you wouldn't be an Ethiopian anymore, and that would be that much more of a shame. Like, you cannot replace a gojo, the most well-made gojo in Ethiopia, with an Italian building, and tell me that this is the best building that Ethiopia has ever made, because it's not Ethiopia that made it.
I would say it's a trade-off between, you can assume, I mean, this is counterfactual, right? This is what historians call counterfactual. If this or that hadn't happened, what would have happened differently next? There's no way to answer these questions.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say most likely the trade-off would have been between modern technology or infrastructure. The buildings would have been better, the roads, the constructions, the institutions might have been a little more stable or a little more, but along colonial lines. It's a trade-off between things, between material things and consciousness, right? Like, we would have given up consciousness to receive materiality in response, in return. And I don't think that's a trade-off that I would want, right? Because I always felt that studying history, that intellectual and cultural history is more significant than social, political, institutional history.
Okay.
Because, especially technical, I think I told you, who was I telling this to? I used to cover technology as a journalist. I used to write about technology. The thing is, I would read articles that were written 10 years before, and it was like reading something written by a dinosaur. Or 10 years during the technical revolution is like 1,000 years during the before the Industrial Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So technical things, material things change so quickly. People don't even realize how quickly they change. Look at how quickly the materiality of Addis Ababa has changed. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean institutions don't matter. Doesn't mean politics doesn't matter. But political institutions evolve very quickly. Parties come and go. Social institutions, the courts, what you do, the legal system, it comes, it goes, with time.
Yeah.
Ideas, the ideas in Islam have been around over 1,000 years. The ideas in Christianity and the Western, Judeo-Christian tradition, thousands of years. The Enlightenment, which we think of as new, right? We talk on this station about how modern, scientific, Western, rationalist thought, all these, Western ideas are so new. Well, they're new to us, but they've been around 500 years, right? And that's new when you look at the history. So I'm saying, like, consciousness is more lasting. Yeah. Ideas, the ideational is more lasting than the material. So I'll take that trade-off every time. I'll take I'll take winning the Battle of Adwa and remaining independent and not having the residue of colonialism, in our minds, over having, sturdier buildings in Addis Ababa.
I definitely agree with you. Because, like, you can't expect someone else to teach you to be more like you. You can't expect anybody else to give you the technology that you could have brought into the world. Like, an Italian can, or like an European can teach you a lot about technology because that information hasn't gotten into the country. But there are certain things that you can add to that technology that makes it authentic and even more powerful, because your individual intellect went into it, your individual history went into it. There's so much information that we don't pay attention to, while we're paying attention to the information that comes from abroad. Like, even on our socials or social media, like, a lot of people, like, okay, like, let me talk about this. Like, colonialization is not just like physical colonialization. There's a mental colonialization that happens as well, right? Like, if we are stuck believing that the technology and the infrastructure of the Western world is way better than ours, we stop ourselves from creating something from within, and always will be seeking to a Western culture to teach us how to do us better. Right? So, like, that's something I like a lot of people to remember, that, like, there's an impact in our history. There's an impact in who we are. There's an impact in our land. The ideas that come from here as well can actually be an addition to the technology that's going on to the technology that we have in the world. So how about we kind of like come back to it? Hey, how about what do I contribute to this technology? How do I use the history of my ancestors, of my fathers, of my land to actually add to it? Because it's not like the Western world doesn't need to teach you everything in order for you to be exactly like yourself.
Yeah.
You know? And so it's all about like finding value in exactly who it is that you are.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Valuing yourself. We've talked about that a number of times in other contexts on this station. When I had actually one of the owners of Shifta. Right? Shifta is owned by a couple of Maranatha, and I talked about self-reliance. That's the name of that episode when it comes to entrepreneurship. Yeah. Given that it seems like everybody's having a hard time relying on their workers, on their clients, on their partners, doing business in this town with everything that's going on. He was like, now you have to really see your own value. We talked about entrepreneurship with Haben from the interim CEO at Asa Damena. The idea that you have to kind of value yourself and think positively about sort of self-assertion as well. Well, even that, if you are in a society where, and we talk about this when it comes to pedagogy and environment. If you're in a society where people are used to being defeated, or you're in a defeated society where the power resides with people who look different from you, and you look to other people to tell you everything, and you don't see your own value, or you don't see your own strength, or you don't pursue your own. What does that lead to?
Victim consciousness, basically. You're in a victim consciousness.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you're always going to be the victim. You're waiting for somebody else to save you. So you're always going to be a victim, and that person is going to be a hero. So when you're self-reliant, you're saving yourself. Like, you don't need a hero. You're no longer the victim. You're actually, you're the one in power. So when you get stuck in that victim consciousness, it keeps you seeking for somebody else to give you power. Right. That power no longer comes from you, it comes from somebody else. And yes, they can do it, but it will also mean that you will have to lose faith in everything that you have to offer to the world. In your power remains silent. Even though it's there, because you're not acknowledging it, you can't do anything with it. It's like having a weapon you can't use. It's there, but it has no bullets. Because the bullets come from the confidence you have in yourself and your ability to say, today, I am a powerful person.
It sounds like you and I agree that consciousness, conscientiousness, the mind is more important than the external.
Yeah.
I mean, everything is a matter of how you look at it. Now, I know people will be like, listen, people who have a certain amount of material wealth and comfort can always say mind over matter, but the poor person on the street will tell you a different story, that material things do matter.
Yeah.
But I would say that condition of materiality changes and comes and goes, and really your experience of it is always filtered through or mediated through the mind and through consciousness. And this is a way of relating what we're talking about as far as Adwa and national consciousness and resistance to the conversations we had involving sort of Mastawa, with some of the people you've brought in and some of the communities you're interested in, as far as spiritual observance, meditation, those kinds of practices. The idea in those worlds is essentially the same, right? It's that it's the mind determines the external, or interprets the external, not the other way around, right?
Well, it's a two-way street. So there's this thing called correspondence. So your environment impacts your internal world just as much as your internal world impacts the environment.
Right.
But regardless of what that is like everything comes from the mind.
Right.
But it doesn't just come from your mind. It comes from the co-creators within your environment. So they have a mind too, and their mind has an impact, and that impact. So like
it's reflected back on you
yeah,
from the environment, from the external conditions. Right.
So it's like puzzle pieces.
Right.
So if you want to exist in a community, if you want to exist on your own, you can exist on your own based on what happens in your own mind. You can create your own community. You can have your own circle. You can actually go start living in the mountains and just be like extremely happy. But if you want to exist in a society, you have to also consider what's going on through the other person's mind. You have to also have faith in the impact that you have in that community. But if you're letting another person's mind rule your actions every single day, that's allowing yourself to be colonized. So that's a colonization in itself. If you resonate to someone else's idea and actually trigger something within you, then that is not so much of a sacrifice, because it did trigger something within you. You're co-creating.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there is a back and forth between the ideational and the material, and this is like a really central philosophical question, which is sort of like a chicken and egg kind of question. But this is, I mean, we were talking about enlightenment, all this Western thought that comes from the Enlightenment, liberal Enlightenment thought. They actually believed more in, it starts with Descartes, pre-Enlightenment really, which is, I think, therefore I am, right? Like, I know that I'm here because of my rational mind. And then there's kind of been a reaction to that in the 20th century with people like Heidegger, who are like, no, we're embodied. And then there's the phenomenologists and all that, who are talking more about phenomena or the being, materiality. It goes back even to Thomas Hobbes in the Western tradition, and the Leviathan, and the idea of sort of shapes and bodies in motion. That there's a reality is contained outside the world, and that your thoughts, your ideas, they might correspond with reality, but they do not a reality make. There is a real there that is there, right? And we have to kind of surpass our minds. The only thing that is legitimate, and again, this is the basis of the sort of scientific thought. So it kind of goes back and forth, right? Between what's more important, is it the ideational? Because the mind can be a tricky thing. It can go out, and then the law of attraction, which it says, well, but still, even the tricks in the mind gets reified. This is the concept of reification. When the mind gets so we're getting into a very philosophical conversation, but I think it's an important one, because this gets back to the concept of education in our society. I'm very, very much dismayed by what happened in our generation, where I think because people saw that the politics were going off in the wrong, a lot of people were getting in trouble who went and studied politics. So a lot of the younger generation, they're like, we're going to learn, material things, science, technology, engineering, math, computers, and this also corresponds with the technological revolution, people like making a lot of money on it. And there was a period in our time in our politics where everybody kind of be like, we're just going to build stuff and not have, there was a period where there was no ideology, which I believe is a period when a lot of mistakes were made as far as there not being much guidance, policy guidance to the kind of the material things. And this has to do with the devalorization of education, especially what we're trying to kind of talk about on this station, which is liberal arts education, social sciences, analytical or critical thinking, appreciation of the arts. I mean, this is not to say that material things do not matter. Again, they do. But there needs to be a guidance through people who think...
And it also needs to be balanced out with that material. If you're associating value to a particular material, the why of it comes from that social science. What is it giving to the community? What is it giving to me personally? Like, what is it giving to my next generation? It's not just the fact that you build that stuff. Like, the atomic bomb, it was built, it was phenomenal when it came to science, but it ruined the whole population.
Right.
In a lot of places. And, the impact, the intention that went into that was not initially to hurt people, but the way it was used hurt people.
Right.
So it's like, it's not, I think we need to bring back that a little bit of the understanding we had in the past, like kind of combine it, because there was a time in our lives where we were just more concerned about, like our nature, our community, or that we only attached value to things that were like of the society. But now we attach value to material, only material. If we can combine those two, we could have a world which is like way more peaceful for all of us.
No, we have to combine those two. Is how I would put it. You're absolutely right. It's not even that if we could, like, we have to maintain both. There's no ideational without the material. There's no material without the ideational. That's what you meant by correspondence, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just interesting to me that that we would ever abandon sort of, because people at the top of the tech world are artistic minded. Steve Jobs was a creative guy. He's the one who came up with our concept of fonts. Right, he sat there and looked at all these different ways of writing fonts. Nobody had ever thought of that before. Yeah. Right, it takes some kind of creative breakthrough or some kind of, some kind of artistic or critical thought process. Albert Einstein was famously a bad student, and wasn't really able to fit into the category. But theoretical physics is science, is natural science, right? But it requires somebody who was able to just kind of see the world a little bit differently and just kind of imagine something that they couldn't prove, especially general relativity. They couldn't prove until like years and years and years later. And still to this day, people are like, how did he realize? How did he put that connection in his mind? Yeah. So this isn't to say that everybody who studies liberal arts or social science is some kind of critical thinking genius, but there has to be some kind of space for that. A medical doctor, the medical sciences are a big area of expansion right now in the country, which is necessary. We need as many doctors as we can. A lot of young people I know, a lot of young people we know, are going into the medical fields, and that's great. But like, I have arguments with them where they're like, everything is objective and everything is about what is the solution and what is the prescription, and I'm like, okay, well, when I go to a doctor, sometimes they get stuff wrong, and the way I know that is that everybody says, how about you go and get a second opinion? Right, so not everything, even what medical doctors or technical fields are, not everything is a matter of clear-cut opinion or clear-cut fact. Right, there's a hierarchy within fact, and there's a hierarchy within opinion. Social media has come along and made us think that everybody's opinion is equal and that there's no such thing as expertise in critical, or that there's no value to critical thinking. It's just your opinion. Not every opinion is equal, and not every fact is equal. Right, like some facts evolve with time, or more subject to kind of change, and then at the very core, really the only thing that's immutable is like the immutable laws of physics. And then everything else, kind of, we think we know, we're pretty sure, people in this country and most religious societies question the theory of evolution. Yeah. Well, then don't tell me that you're sure about certain things being facts, because you that's a very basic tenet of science, right? So all this is to say these issues are quite complicated. And somehow tie back to Adwa, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, you can go into a lot of. That's why we raise a lot of these topics. It's just like it triggers different thought processes within us. Like this very day, living with what is it that Adwa taught us? Like, how is it that we could carry that lesson, that history into the next world, and what are we teaching about it? How are we celebrating it today? And I think the words that we contribute to our audience and the words that we have a discussion about, and that's where a part of history of Adwa is also told, right? So how it impacted the society that is in the place that celebrates Adwa, or for the community that does celebrate Adwa. And another thing is you mentioned something about I forgot. Never mind.
Was it about facts and opinions?
Yes,
okay, go
facts. Ahead. So when it comes to facts, there's also the perspective of there's a particular fact, but the way you understand it and your perspective on that particular fact and your history and your intention, it just changes. ለምሳሌ so a doctor gives you an opinion about what you should do to heal, right? If you go to a healer, the first thing they'll tell you is first to listen to your own body, your perspective matters more than the opinion they're gonna give you afterwards. So like the healer is you, and then you tell them, like, even when you go to a doctor, they'll tell you where it hurts, they take blood tests, and based on those facts they give you a solution. But
right, because they usually ask a lot of questions.
They do.
So the first thing doctors do is they ask you all the questions.
And
you
healers
know better.
do that too.
Yeah.
Exactly. They ask you a lot of questions, like they will check your energy, like see what type of things you're allergic to and stuff like that. But they also like give you a space to actually kind of bring in your own your own personal healing powers into play. Both doctors. So there are doctors who do this, where so a doctor could give you a medicine to heal, and some doctors will just give you the medicine. Based on their perspective, it's just like medicine that will heal you. But this is the prescription. Go ahead. You'll be healed in like a few weeks. This is the advice he gives you. And another doctor could be like, you know what, you could also eat right, exercise, you know, do a little bit of meditation, on top of that, also add this medicine, you know. And
especially if there are different fields, right?
Exactly.
But even people within the same field will often completely disagree.
Yes. Yeah. So their perspective on the power of the advice they're giving you, on the facts, on the medication, on the materials that they're providing you to heal yourself, based on the perspective of the doctor, will change. So some doctors will just give you drugs, some doctors will actually give you advice and drugs, and some doctors will just give you advice. Or some doctors will like give you, so botanists will give you different ingredients of plants. Like this, if you mix this with this, based on this condition, like you can actually heal yourself through this medicine, natural medicine. So like the fact remains the same, the disease is the same. The approach to healing is different.
Right.
So that perspective is what I'm talking about. Like the way we twist the facts, the way we use the facts is also based on our perspective, that, you know, what we've experienced.
And when we approach you know, trying to heal ourselves with doctors and so on, usually when we talk to people, they're like, hey, get a second opinion, get a third opinion, you know, talk to as many doctors as possible, right? I think this is one area where we can actually apply the mentality that we have about science, technology, engineering, math, and so on, even more so, because it's a little more subjective, a little more a matter of interpretation, to the liberal arts, to history, which is consult as many different doctors, consult as many different experts as possible. People used to have this mentality. One thing that runs throughout the liberal arts, if you go back like to the late Middle Ages, to the early modern period, people used to think that what's contained within a book was like, because usually most of the books that people read were scripture, right? So they had the same perspective on books, especially since there were very few people who were capable of writing. Very few people capable of reading, let alone writing. And this is even in Europe, right? Where writing and reading, where books were popular. Such that people thought of reading what was written in a book like, this must be true, right? This is objective reality. People had a lot of trust in what was written in a book. And that there's a consistent arc as far as the liberal arts, as far as social sciences, of people having less and less and less faith in what they read. Over a course of hundreds of years, until we get to the 20th and 21st century, where it got to the point where people were like, well, maybe there is no truth. Postmodernists believe there is no truth, right? There's no such thing as objective reality. Deconstructionists argue that you can only define words or anything that's expressed in words through other words. So it's like a self-referential loop. So, you know, discourse analysis and all that is like, let's just focus on the language people use to describe the language. There is no way of there's no reference point to reality. It just becomes like a circular, you know. And I think this is dangerous. The people have gone in that extreme. Now people have kind of pulled back because people realize this contributes to the notion that academia, that the liberal arts, is an ivory tower detached from reality, and that it has no relevance and probably shouldn't be funded as a result. Right? It's just people expressing, everybody's interpretation of, you know, and no knowledge gets produced at the same time, right? But that's another kind of arc, is that like we have to figure out how much do we trust experts, or how much do we trust what's in writing, and that's by cross-checking and by contextualizing. Who is this person? What did they write? Do they have an agenda? right? Think of it as more like this is their contribution. Let me get an array of contributions before people are just kind of, and that takes work. That's why people don't usually do it.
Yeah. It's easier to like give someone else power over your life. It's so much easier because you don't have to do a lot of work and a lot of research.
No.
So that's why we pay for it now. Like we pay for somebody else's expertise because we do not want to do that research into our own lives. Right? So like it also has, that's also like allowing other people to colonize you in a way.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily have to be like white power, black power. It shouldn't be like a particular society. You allow other people to colonize you as well by not by not doing your due diligence.
Right.
And
that is a good way of putting it. Yeah. Other people colonize you when you don't let you do due diligence, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a foreign nation or a foreign civilization, right? Colonialism is just there's a difference though between colonialism and subjugation. Right? Colonialism is more thorough than sort of subjugation. Like, the British subjugated the greatest empire in history, which is not the Romans, not the Assyrians, not anybody in the West, certainly not the Nazis and not even the British. It was China. Right? China came up with papyrus, paper, gunpowder. They had these long dynasties. Very solid. Now they've reasserted themselves in recent years. But how did the British do it? They did it using drugs, using opium. The Opium Wars, where they flooded, these Chinese capitals and the elites there with opium and got everybody high. And it's a very sad story that they pulled that off. But they never colonized China. The Chinese, other than in certain places where they did colonize it, in this very south, like Hong Kong and so on, but mainland China, it doesn't speak English any more than everybody else now speaks English, but not as a colonial language. They maintained their educational system. And they maintained an alphabet, and it's not even an alphabet, it's Chinese characters that makes no sense. It's 10,000.
But like for them, it's
I'm sorry. Objectively, it doesn't make any sense. It's 10,000 words. It's 10,000 letters. 10,000 letters. But they still made it work, right? Even though they need an alphabet, but they had invested so much in it that even though there's just way too many letters, and it's not an efficient way of it. They still made it work, right? But so you could be subjugated, you could be underneath somebody, and not be colonized. Colonize is when, as you said, when you just let the other person do the work for you. Yeah. Let the other person, when you accept a position of what do you call it, victimhood consciousness?
Yes,
right.
Victim consciousness.
Victim consciousness, right? So there's that difference as well. Because people often will argue, well, Ethiopia was colonized. I've heard this argument. Ethiopia was colonized by the British after World War II because they had control over the external situation. The Italians had control over the internal situation, but there was always resistance when the Italians were there. Yeah. And even if the British had control over the British had an agreement with Haile Selassie after World War II that Ethiopia, after the Italians were defeated, that Ethiopia couldn't make any treaties or any negotiations without British.
And that's what started Adwa,
right.
Actually, that treaty, right? The Wuchale Treaty.
Right.
That's what started Adwa. So they had a text that was, when translated, said something completely different than what Ethiopians agreed on based on that language. Like we come back to that language barrier as well. Yeah.
They did that again all these years later. So before Adwa and then after World War II. They had to control in the 1950s, right? And so the British have those agreements with a lot of people, right? Because they're more powerful than everybody, for many, many years. But America has a sphere of influence where they basically, NATO, right? All this talk about Ukraine right now, and Ukraine is willingly subjugated to, but it's not colonized. It's not like the Ukrainians are redefining themselves in the image of the Americans as a civilizing mission works. You know what I mean? So like. I hope people understand. Like Ethiopia has been and continues to be subjugated. We're subjugated people. Don't get it twisted. But we're not colonized, right? We don't let the other person, as you put it, do the work for us. Is the point I was trying to make.
Exactly. All right. On that point, okay. So one more question for you. What would be the big takeaway from this battle, from this situation? What would be the takeaway from this episode for our audience? What would you like to say to our audience that, will really wrap up Adwa for us?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say Well, two things. Getting back to Sven Rubenson's book, please read Sven Rubenson's book. Yes, he's a European, but he's a European who very consciously was like, I'm going to tell this story from the perspective of the Ethiopians.
Right. We'll have a link in the description box
Absolutely.
for that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Please read Sven Rubenson's book. But really, in reading it, the whole point is to acknowledge that we have agency. That not every decision is made by, that the internal dynamics are every bit as significant as the external dynamics. And, as you said, I think you put it very well, don't let yourself be colonized, because letting yourself be colonized is, okay, listen, we still provide the labor force, but the actual work of dealing with challenges, of thinking for ourselves, to deal with our challenges, and let that we've ceded that control. We can be subjugated. I mean, different societies are subjugated to other societies. It's not always their fault. They're defeated in battle and so on. But that doesn't mean we have to willingly be appeased. And, one of the things that makes it, and Sven Rubenson makes this point, one of the things that made Ethiopia different is that there was a conscious decision to resist. And guess what happens 40 years later? Same powers come back. Mm-hmm. Again, there's a resistance, mm-hmm. right? It could have easily folded. And if Ethiopia had folded in the 1890s, maybe it would have more easily folded in the 1930s. Yeah. But there was a sense of, well, we pulled this off before, right? So you're also establishing an example for future generations that, hey, it is possible. Because for a lot of Africans, the idea of defeating, and still this day, I've heard people be like, wait, Ethiopia defeated Italy in the 1890s? What? How's that possible? That's weird. An African army defeating a European army, right? And also I've heard people, I'll make this point real quick. I've heard it's bandied about like it's as a matter of fact that the first time that a non-Western or non-European or non-white army was defeated defeated a white army, a European army, was in 1905 when the Japanese defeated Russia. I think it was a conflict over some region or something like that. But and I'm like, and I always have to be like, what do you mean? 1905 is 9 years after Adwa, right? But people don't really want to address it, right? I'll give another example of something people don't want to address. This is a historical fact. The richest man in history, from what we know, from the assessments that we make, is an African. Yeah. From the 14th century, from the Malian Empire, the former Malian Emperor Moussa, who made his wealth off of salt and gold. Now with the internet, people are now opening up to Moussa. But for the longest time, they freaking did not want to acknowledge this.
You know what? Like, I heard about the story like last year, and I was so surprised. And I also heard it's like that's how Americans realized that there's gold in power in Ethiopia, because the richest man in I'm sorry, I said Ethiopia again. I'm sorry.
No, it's cool. It's right.
America. In Africa, there's a lot of power and riches in Africa. They discovered this because Moussa went around like spreading gold wherever he goes, and it's like, who is this guy like spreading gold on the streets and giving it to everybody? How dare he And then they kind of discovered, and that's how colonialism started. I don't know if that's true.
It's hundreds of years before colonialism. There were these great empires. It's not some cliche that was made up, by preachers years later of all this lost, glorious African past. We started civilization. We kind of did. Egypt is the birthplace of civilization. Mm-hmm. Sorry to offend any, religious people, but you could argue that it's the birthplace of Christianity, or a lot of what Christianity refers back to, and of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Obviously everybody knows about music, but other aspects of the arts are one way or another appropriated from or assimilated from Africa. And so this is all to say, like,
and we're really great dancers.
There's that too. They say we're more embodied, whereas Europeans are more up here, right? To get back to our body-mind conversation from earlier. Yes. Europeans are more like embodied. They reside in their intellect versus where we reside. And I would argue that even
in our bodies.
Right. See, I would argue that that's a false distinction, as we both know. Mind and body are not really separate. But
not really. But like what the muscle you take time building is the one that will be the strongest. If you're gonna do a lot of arm exercises, then your arm will be strong.
Right. And so when we decide to only pursue embodied practices, physical dance and music and sports and so on like that, and part of that is in the U.S. is part of a tradition of minstrelsy, which is the black person, the slave, entertaining the colonial master, usually with dance, usually with... Now, that's not to say that we don't have great dance practices as well, but not to the exclusion of, not to cede control over our minds and hand that over and let them do the thinking for us. You put it very well. I mean, colonialism is when you allow somebody else to think for you or to do the hard work of critical thought for you. So I think that's a good place for us to stop, right?
Yes, that would be an amazing place for us to stop. I'd just like to say, like, believe in your power. Then you believe in your system and believe in your country. Thank you for joining us, Zewde.
Thank you.
It was an amazing episode. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, everybody.